What would you think if you heard a child speaking a language that no one could recognize? A language so ancient that its roots ran deeper than humanity itself. In a quiet village not far from the place that would later become known as Chernobyl in 1835, this is exactly what happened. Imagine a cold autumn evening, when the wind whispers through the bare branches of trees and a mist rises above the dark waters of the Pripyat River. It was here, in a tiny hut on the outskirts of the village of Strakalasai, that a boy was born whose appearance made even the most experienced midwife recoil in horror. Not because of any physical abnormalities, but because of the sounds that began to come from his tiny lips, sounds that a newborn should not have made, and especially not in a language that no one could identify. If you find this story intriguing, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other little-known historical mysteries hidden in the darkness of time. According to the parish records of the village church of St. Elijah, the boy was named Mikhail Kravchuk. He was born into a family of ordinary peasants, Alexander and Maria Kravchuk. The family lived modestly, like most residents of this region at that time, engaged in agriculture and fishing. Nothing in their ancestry foreshadowed that their firstborn would become a source of horror for the entire village. The first to notice something unusual was the midwife Agafya Petrenko, a respected and experienced woman who had delivered hundreds of babies in the surrounding villages. In her notes, which were discovered almost a century later in the archives of the Kiev Theological Seminary, she describes the first moments of Mikhail's life as follows. The infant did not utter the usual cry of a newborn, but instead made sounds resembling the speech of an adult, but in a language I had never heard in my 63 years of life. These sounds were like the rustling of leaves and the murmuring of water at the same time, but there was a sense of meaning and a certain rhythm to them, as if the child was trying to communicate something. I immediately crossed myself and sprinkled the infant with holy water, but it did not stop him. He continued to speak even when I handed him to his mother. Lord, have mercy on us all. These records could have been dismissed as the superstitious fear of an uneducated woman, if not for the numerous testimonies of other villagers confirming the strangeness of what was happening. The archives also contain fragments of the diary of the local priest, Father Nikolai, who was called to the Kravchuk's house the day after Mikhail's birth. The priest, an educated man who had graduated from the Kiev Theological Seminary and knew several languages, including Latin, Greek, and Polish, also could not determine the language the infant was speaking. Today I was called to the house of Alexander Kravchuk to bless his newborn son. Upon arrival, I was immediately led to the cradle where the infant lay of ordinary appearance, without any signs of diabolical interference. However, when I began to read the prayer, the infant opened his eyes and began to utter words in a language that I could not identify. It was not any of the languages known to me, neither Slavic, nor Germanic, nor Romance. The sounds were melodic, but foreign to human speech, more like the singing of birds mixed with the sound of flowing water. I spent several hours trying to determine the nature of this phenomenon and came to the conclusion that it was either a divine miracle or the work of the unclean one. I sprinkled the infant with holy water, but this did not cause any reaction, which rather testifies in favor of the former assumption. Nevertheless, I ordered the parents to keep careful observations and immediately inform me of any unusual incidents. In the following weeks, Father Nikolai regularly visited the Kravchuk's house and kept records of Mikhail's development. These records indicate that the boy was developing physically normally, but continued to speak in an unknown language. It is noteworthy that by 3 months he was already uttering complex phrases with the intonation of an adult, although ordinary children at this age barely begin to coo. This caused increasing concern not only for the parents but also for all the villagers. Alexander Kravchuk, a hard-working and respected man in the village, began to notice that neighbors were avoiding his house, and some even crossed themselves when passing by. Maria, Mikhail's mother, fell into a deep melancholy and often cried, locking herself in the pantry. She loved her son, but the fear of the unknown was stronger. According to neighbors' testimonies, she often said that she felt as if it was not her child lying in the cradle, but someone else who just looked like her son. The situation attracted the attention not only of local residents, but also of the authorities. The archives of the Kiev Governorate contain a letter from the local police officer addressed to the governor, in which he reports a strange case in the village of Strakalisai and asks for instructions on how to proceed. The governor, an educated man and skeptical of superstitions, ordered a doctor to be sent to the village to examine the child and determine the true causes of what was happening. In June of 1835, Dr. Anton Ivanovsky, a graduate of the medical faculty of Kharkiv University, arrived in Strakalisai. He spent 2 weeks in the village carefully studying Mikhail and keeping detailed records of his observations. These records have been preserved in the archives of the Medical Society and are of great interest to researchers of this case. Male infant Mikhail Kravchuk, 6 months old, physically developed normally for his age. Weight and height correspond to average indicators. Reactions to light, sound, and touch, normal. Appetite good. Sleep peaceful. Anomalies of internal organs not detected upon palpation. Skull shape, normal, without visible deviations. The only anomaly is speech activity significantly exceeding the norm for this age. The infant utters complex sound structures with intonation and rhythm characteristic of meaningful speech. The language in which the infant speaks could not be identified, despite consultations with linguists from the university. In structure, it does not belong to any of the known language groups. It is noteworthy that the infant reacts to the speech of others, although apparently does not understand Russian or Ukrainian. When addressed, he stops talking and listens attentively, then responds in his own language, as if carrying on a meaningful dialogue. Dr. Ivanovsky, being a man of science, tried to find a rational explanation for the phenomenon. In his report to the governor, he suggested that the child might have a rare form of neurological disorder causing premature development of the speech centers of the brain, and the strange sounds are the result of imitating some sounds of nature that the child heard. However, he himself admitted that this explanation was unsatisfactory, since it did not explain the structuredness and consistency of Mikhail's language. But what Dr. Ivanovsky discovered next was even stranger. He noticed that when Mikhail spoke, the surrounding objects sometimes began to behave strangely. Candles flickered for no apparent reason, the water in a glass near the cradle began to ripple, and once a wooden toy moved across the table by itself several centimeters. The doctor carefully checked whether there were any natural causes for these phenomena, such as drafts or vibrations from passing carts, but found no satisfactory explanation. Even more alarming, Dr. Ivanovsky began to notice that after prolonged sessions of observing Mikhail, he himself began to experience severe headaches and the sensation that he almost understood what the child was saying, as if the meaning of the words was on the very edge of consciousness, but could not penetrate it completely. In his diary, which was not included in the official report, he wrote, June 14th, 1835. Today I spent more than 3 hours at Mikhail's cradle, trying to record and systematize the sounds he makes. I noticed a strange pattern. Some combinations of sounds are repeated regularly. Perhaps these are some basic words or phrases. But the strangest thing is that by the end of the session I had a distinct feeling that I was beginning to understand individual fragments of his speech. I cannot convey the meaning in words, but there were images of a very ancient forest, dark water, and some creatures moving in the depths. After that, a severe headache began, and I was forced to stop observing. In the evening, I noticed that I had made several entries in the diary that I do not remember making. The handwriting is mine, but I do not remember writing these words. They are written in a language similar to the one Mikhail speaks. In the morning I reread these entries, but they had already disappeared. Only blank sheets remained on the page. I fear that my mental state is beginning to cause concern. It is necessary to complete the study and return to Kiev. However, what happened next amazed even the experienced doctor. The day after this entry, Maria Kravchuk reported that Mikhail had begun to utter individual words in Russian, mixing them with his incomprehensible dialect. By the end of the week, he was already speaking simple phrases in Russian, albeit with a strange accent and unusual intonation. Dr. Ivanovsky carefully recorded each new word that Mikhail uttered and was amazed at the speed with which the child was mastering the Russian language. In 3 days, his vocabulary grew from 10 words to more than 100, which is absolutely impossible for an ordinary 6-month-old infant. But even stranger was the content of the first meaningful phrases that Mikhail uttered. According to the doctor's records, The first thing the boy said in Russian was, "They are returning when the stars align differently." Then followed other mysterious phrases. "The water remembers what was before people, and the black sun will rise above the forest." These statements seemed meaningless, but caused an inexplicable feeling of anxiety in all who heard them. Dr. Ivanovsky tried to enter into a dialogue with Mikhail, asking simple questions that a child his age could answer, but the answers he received were far from childish. When the doctor asked, "What is your name?" Mikhail answered not with his own name, but with the phrase, "I have many names, the oldest cannot be uttered." To the question, "How old are you?" the answer followed, "I am older than the trees and rivers." Alarmed by these answers, the doctor decided to check whether this was some form of ventriloquism, when the parents or someone else spoke for the child. He conducted an experiment, isolating Mikhail in a separate room where no one but the doctor could be present. The results were the same. The boy continued to speak both in his incomprehensible language and in Russian, with the same strange intonations and content. In his report to the governor, Dr. Ivanovsky tried to adhere to a scientific approach, suggesting that the boy might have a rare form of savantism, when a person demonstrates outstanding abilities in one particular area, in this case in the study of languages. However, in his personal notes he was less restrained. "I can no longer explain what is happening from a scientific point of view. All my attempts to find a rational explanation for the phenomenon are failing. The last thing I can assume is that the boy somehow has the ability to absorb knowledge and languages from the surrounding space as a sponge absorbs water. But this does not explain that first language in which he began to speak immediately after birth, a language that no one knows and that sounds so alien to the human ear. I am beginning to fear that we are dealing with something that goes beyond our understanding of nature and the human mind." What they found later was not included in any official report. After 3 weeks of research, Dr. Ivanovsky suddenly stopped his work and hastily left the village. In a letter to the governor, he only briefly reported that he had not found anything unusual in the child's development, and that the rumors about his supernatural abilities were greatly exaggerated by superstitious peasants. He recommended that the case be considered closed and that no more of the empire's resources be spent on it. However, in the doctor's personal archive, which was discovered by his great-grandson almost a century later, a sealed box was found with the inscription, "Do not open, burn after my death." The great-grandson ignored the instruction and found inside a diary and several artifacts related to the case of Mikhail Kravchuk. The last entries in the diary, dated the day of the doctor's departure from Strakalasai, reveal the true reason for his hasty flight, June 28, 1835. "Today something happened that forever changed my understanding of the world and human nature. I was conducting my usual observations of Mikhail, recording his speech, when he suddenly looked directly at me with his unchildlike, meaningful eyes and said in the purest Russian, without any accent, 'Anton Sergeyevich, you know that I am not who you think I am. I need your help to complete what has been started.' I was so amazed that I did not immediately find an answer. A child of 6 months old not only addressed me by my first name and patronymic, but also spoke like an educated, adult man. When I asked him who he really was, he smiled a non-childlike smile and replied, 'I am a guest from afar, from a time that was before time and from a place that lies beneath all places. We come when the stars align in a certain way. The last time I was here was when the first cities were being built and people still remembered the old gods. Now I have returned because something important is approaching.' I asked what exactly was approaching and why he was here. Mikhail replied, 'In many years, in this place, an event will occur that will change the delicate structure of reality. A breach between worlds will open. We must prepare for it.' I was sure that I was talking to some ancient being who had taken the form of a child, a being possessing knowledge and understanding far beyond human limits. When I asked if he could prove that he was telling the truth, he pointed to a candle burning on the table and uttered several words in his strange language. The candle went out and then lit up again, but now the flame was not orange but blue, and it gave off cold instead of heat. I reached out my hand and felt an icy cold emanating from the flame. Then Mikhail said, 'That is enough for you to believe. Now listen carefully. I will pass on to you knowledge that you must preserve for future generations. It will be needed when the time comes. The entry ends there, and the next few pages of the diary are filled with strange symbols, similar to hieroglyphs, but not corresponding to any known writing system. Next to the diary, in the box, lay a small wooden object resembling a child's toy, carved from dark wood. It depicted a creature remotely resembling a human, but with elongated limbs and a head of a strange shape. The same symbols as in the diary were carved on the base of the figure. What happened to Dr. Ivanovsky after his return to Kiev is not known for certain. Official documents contain information that he continued to practice medicine, but completely abandoned scientific activity and avoided any contact with the academic community. Colleagues noted that he became withdrawn and unsociable, often muttering something to himself and making strange entries in a diary that he always carried with him. In 1842, at the age of 37, he suddenly left his practice and moved to a small village in the depths of Polesia, where he lived as a hermit until his death in 1860. The fate of Mikhail Kravchuk is very difficult to trace. In the parish books of the Church of St. Elijah, there is a record that at the age of 3, he suddenly fell ill with an unknown disease and died within a few days. However, no details about the illness or funeral have been preserved. Moreover, later records from 1843 mention a certain Mikhail Kravchuk as one of the students of the church parish school, which casts doubt on the fact of his death in early childhood. The most interesting information about the further fate of Mikhail was found in the archives of the Kiev Theological Seminary. There are records of the admission in 1850 of 15-year-old Mikhail Kravchuk from the village of Strakalasai. In the character reference written by the local priest, it is said that the boy showed exceptional abilities in languages, mastering, in addition to Russian and Ukrainian, also Church Slavonic, Greek, and Latin, practically without instruction. In addition, he demonstrated a deep knowledge of theological texts, which, as he claimed, he had not studied anywhere but simply knew. Interestingly, the seminary records also mention that Mikhail often spoke in an unknown language in his sleep, which caused concern among his roommates. One of the teachers, Father Pavel Vereshchagin, even compiled a small dictionary of this language, recording words and trying to determine their meaning from the context when Mikhail switched from the unknown language to Russian or Ukrainian. This dictionary has been preserved in the archives and is of great interest to linguists and researchers of paranormal phenomena. The dictionary contains about 300 words and phrases, many of which, according to Father Pavel, were related to astronomical phenomena, time cycles, and some rituals. Some words, according to his observations, caused strange physical effects when Mikhail pronounced them, from a slight flickering of candle flames to sudden gusts of wind in windless weather. Father Pavel, being a deeply religious, but at the same time educated and inquisitive man, tried to find an explanation for this phenomenon within the framework of the Christian worldview. In his notes, he suggested that Mikhail might be gifted with the rare gift of speaking in tongues, glossolalia, which is mentioned in the New Testament. However, he was confused by the fact that Mikhail's language was structured and consistent, which is uncharacteristic of glossolalia, which is usually a spontaneous and incoherent stream of sounds. Mikhail Kravchuk graduated from the seminary with honors in 1856 and was recommended for further education at the Kiev Theological Academy. However, instead, unexpectedly for everyone, he abandoned his church career and went to St. Petersburg, where he entered the Faculty of History and Philology of the Imperial University. Here his tracks are lost again for several years. The next mention of Mikhail Kravchuk is found in the archives of the Russian Geographical Society. In 1862, he participated in an expedition to the Kola Peninsula, the purpose of which was to study the language and culture of the Sami people. In the report of the head of the expedition, Professor Nikolai Ozaritskovsky, it is noted that Kravchuk showed extraordinary abilities in the study of the Sami language, mastering it in a few weeks, which was an exceptional achievement. Moreover, he discovered similarities between some ancient Sami myths and his own knowledge, which, as he claimed, he had received from an ancient source. Of particular interest are the records of Mikhail himself, made during the expedition. In them he describes strange dreams that visited him when the expedition was near ancient Sami sacred sites. In these dreams he saw beings whom he called those who were before, and who showed him events from the distant past and no less distant future. He wrote, "Today they came to me again in a dream, showed me a place that I know is Strakalasai, but in the distant future. I saw strange structures as tall as mountains and mechanisms moving without horses. And then there was a flash as bright as 1,000 suns, and a black sun surrounded by a fiery ring rose above the forest. The earth became lifeless, and the water in the river glowed with an unnatural light. And they told me that this would happen in many years, when people learn to control the forces that should remain hidden, and when this happens, a breach between worlds will open and they will be able to return. These records take on a sinister meaning in the light of the events that took place in Chernobyl in 1986, more than 120 years after they were made. Many researchers of paranormal phenomena consider this a direct prophecy of the Chernobyl disaster, although skeptics point to the vagueness of the description, which can be interpreted in different ways. After returning from the expedition, Mikhail Kravchuk published several scientific works on comparative linguistics, which were highly appreciated by the academic community. In them he put forward a bold, for that time, hypothesis about the existence of a proto-language that was the common ancestor for all human languages. He claimed that traces of this language can be found in the most ancient myths of various peoples, as well as in the speech of altered states of consciousness, which included glossolalia, shamanic rituals, and speech in a state of trance. Kravchuk's linguistic works attracted the attention not only of scientists, but also of occultists of that time. It is known that in the mid-1860s he corresponded with Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, who showed great interest in his theories about the proto-language. In one of the surviving letters, Blavatsky writes, "Your theory about the primary language of humanity is remarkably consistent with what has been revealed to me by teachers from Tibet. They spoke of a language that existed before the division of races and was common to all people. Moreover, they claimed that some chosen souls are born with an innate knowledge of this language and are able to use it to interact with the forces of nature and beings of other planes of existence. Could you share with me more detailed information about the phonetic structure of this proto-language? I am especially interested in those sound combinations that, according to your observations, cause physical effects in the material world." It is unknown whether Mikhail answered this letter. The archives of the Theosophical Society contain only a mention that in 1867 Blavatsky visited St. Petersburg specifically to meet with Kravchuk. But the meeting did not take place, as Mikhail had left the capital shortly before and his whereabouts were unknown. The next few years of Mikhail Kravchuk's life are shrouded in mystery. His name does not appear in official documents of this period. However, in the diaries of some participants in spiritualist circles of Moscow and St. Petersburg, a certain Mr. K or Teacher M is mentioned, who demonstrated amazing abilities during seances, including speaking in an unknown language and moving objects without touching them. Some researchers believe that this is Mikhail Kravchuk. Only in 1873 did Mikhail reappear in official documents. In the archives of the Ministry of Public Education, his request to be appointed as a teacher of ancient languages in the gymnasium of the city of Chernihiv has been preserved. The request was granted, and for the next few years he spent teaching Latin, Greek, and the history of the ancient world. Colleagues spoke of him as a brilliant teacher with encyclopedic knowledge, but noted his aloofness and strange habits. In particular, he never went to bed before midnight, preferring to spend evenings writing some manuscripts that he never showed to anyone. In addition, he regularly took solitary walks in the forest, even in the most unfavorable weather, and often returned from them with plants and minerals that he collected. In 1877, an incident occurred that forced Mikhail to change his place of residence again. According to the records in the diary of the director of the gymnasium during a history lesson, when Mikhail was telling students about ancient civilizations, he suddenly fell silent, looked out the window and uttered several phrases in an unknown language. At the same moment, all the windows in the classroom shattered simultaneously, although there was no wind or any other obvious reason. None of the students were injured, but the incident caused great concern among parents and city authorities. The next day, Mikhail resigned and left the city without explaining the reasons for his actions. After that, he returned to his native village of Strakalasai, where he bought a small house on the outskirts and lived in seclusion, engaged in scientific work and rarely communicating with fellow villagers. Local residents treated him with superstitious fear, calling him a sorcerer or a forest man, and tried to avoid his house, especially at night. There were rumors that strange singing in an incomprehensible language could be heard from his house at night, and sometimes a strange glow was seen above the roof. In 1883, Mikhail published his last scientific work on the influence of sound vibrations on material objects, which was met by the academic community with bewilderment and skepticism. In it, he claimed that certain sound combinations can cause physical effects in the material world, changing the structure of matter or even the laws of physics on a local scale. As proof, he cited the results of experiments that he allegedly conducted, but the methodology of which was described so vaguely that it was impossible to reproduce them. After the publication of this work, Mikhail completely withdrew from scientific activity and became even more isolated from society. According to local residents, he rarely left his house, only going out at night for walks in the forest. Some claimed they saw him talking to trees or animals, and that the animals were not afraid of him. On the contrary, they gathered around when he spoke in his strange language. In 1887, at the age of 52, Mikhail Kravchuk disappeared under mysterious circumstances. According to neighbors' testimonies, on the evening of April 26th, they saw a bright flash of light in the windows of his house, followed by a sound like thunder, although the sky was clear. When the local police officer arrived at Kravchuk's house the next day to check on him, he found the house empty. All the belongings were in their places, and there were no signs of a struggle or a hasty escape, but Mikhail himself was gone. On the table lay an open manuscript with text in an unknown language. In the center of the room, on the floor, a strange drawing was discovered, resembling a geometric figure composed of intersecting lines and symbols similar to those in Dr. Ivanovsky's diary. The investigation into Mikhail Kravchuk's disappearance yielded no results. Officially, the case was closed with the wording, "Departed in an unknown direction." His house stood abandoned for some time and was then sold by local authorities to a new owner. However, the new residents did not stay there long, complaining of strange sounds at night and an inexplicable feeling of anxiety. Eventually, the house was abandoned and gradually fell into ruin. The story of Mikhail Kravchuk might have remained just a strange case from the past, if not for the events that occurred almost a century later. In 1986, an accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located just a few kilometers from the former village of Strzekalsy. The catastrophe led to radioactive contamination of a vast area and the evacuation of the population from the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. Interestingly, during the aftermath of the accident, several liquidators, independently of each other, reported a strange phenomenon in the forests around the plant, especially in the area of the former village of Strzekalsy. They heard a voice speaking in an incomprehensible language. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Some claimed that they heard the voice utter phrases in Russian, among which was, "The breach has opened, they are returning." One of the liquidators, Sergei Kuznetsov, later recounted in an interview, "We were working the night shift in the forest about 5 kilometers from the plant. Suddenly, all the dosimeters started showing a sharp increase in radiation, even though we were far from the most contaminated areas, and then we heard a voice. It sounded as if it were coming from underground, or maybe from everywhere at once. At first, it was some strange sounds like speech, but definitely not Russian or Ukrainian. And then it said in Russian, but with a strange accent, 'I warned you, but no one listened. Now they are returning through the breach.' We all heard it, me, the group leader, and 3 other guys. We felt uneasy and hurried to get out of there. Later, I learned that other groups had also heard something similar in that area." Official authorities attributed these reports to hallucinations caused by stress and possibly radiation exposure. However, several paranormal researchers became interested in these stories, and they began to collect evidence and compare it with historical records of the strange boy from Strzekalsy. In 1993, Ukrainian historian and folklorist Oleg Shevchenko published a book, Speaking with Shadows, the story of Mikhail Kravchuk and the Chernobyl prophecy, in which he collected all available information about Mikhail and put forward a theory about the connection between the boy's strange language and the disaster that occurred a century and a half later. Shevchenko suggested that Mikhail was a kind of medium or conduit between our world and some other reality, and that his appearance in 1835 was a harbinger of future events. If we take into account all the oddities associated with Mikhail Kravchuk, his unusual language, supernatural abilities, and prophetic visions, then the question arises, was he an ordinary human? Or maybe something else that only took on a human form? And if so, for what purpose did this being appear in a small Polzian village a century and a half before the Chernobyl disaster? Was his appearance a warning that we could not or did not want to hear? Shevchenko wrote in his book. Shevchenko's theory received unexpected confirmation in 1997, when an unusual artifact was discovered during a scientific expedition to the exclusion zone in the area of the former village of Strakalasai. Researchers found a stone with symbols carved on it, which turned out to be identical to those in Dr. Ivanovsky's diary and on the drawing on the floor in Mikhail Kravchuk's house on the day of his disappearance. Radiocarbon analysis showed that the inscriptions on the stone were made approximately 150 years ago, which corresponds to the time of Mikhail's life. Even more surprising was that the stone was located in the center of a small clearing where the vegetation formed a perfectly round circle. Inside this circle, the radiation level was significantly lower than in the surrounding forest, as if something were protecting the place from radioactive contamination. Biologists studying plants inside the circle discovered that they not only were unaffected by radiation, but also exhibited unusually rapid growth and some mutations that made them more resistant to radiation exposure. Linguists tried to decipher the symbols on the stone, comparing them with known ancient scripts, but did not achieve significant success. Some symbols had a distant resemblance to Proto-Phoenician script. Others resembled runes, but most did not correspond to any known writing system. Computer analysis showed that the structure of the text corresponded to some language with a grammar different from all known human languages. In 2000, physicist Dmitry Volkov, who worked at the Kiev Institute for Nuclear Research, put forward an even bolder theory. In his opinion, the Chernobyl accident could indeed have created a kind of breach in the space-time continuum, an area where the laws of physics operate differently. He suggested that such areas could have existed in the past, arising as a result of rare natural phenomena, and that such a breach could have existed in the Strakalasai area in 1835. We know that strong electromagnetic fields can affect space-time, Volkov wrote. During the Chernobyl accident, a huge amount of energy was released, which could briefly deform the very fabric of reality. But what if similar deformations had occurred before, caused not by technological disasters, but by natural phenomena, for example, the strongest geomagnetic storms? And what if such breaches allow something to penetrate into our world from other dimensions or realities? Maybe the story of Mikhail Kravchuk is the story of such a contact. Volkov's theory was met with skepticism by most of the scientific community, but found support among paranormal researchers. In subsequent years, several expeditions were organized to the exclusion zone specifically to study anomalies related to the history of Mikhail Kravchuk. The results of these studies were contradictory, but all participants noted a strange feeling that enveloped them in the area of the former village of Strakalasai, especially at night. Many described it as a feeling of something, a presence, or being watched. In 2011, another incident occurred that added a new layer of mystery to the story of Mikhail Kravchuk. A group of documentary filmmakers filming a movie about Chernobyl set up an automatic camera with an infrared mode in the forest near the site where the stone with symbols was found. In the morning, while reviewing the footage, they discovered a strange anomaly. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, the camera recorded a human figure moving between the trees. The figure was indistinct, as if blurred, but definitely resembled a tall person in 10th century clothing. The figure approached the camera, stopped as if examining it, and then uttered a few words. The sound was distorted, but linguists who analyzed the recording claim that the language has the same phonetic structure as the language that, according to descriptions, Mikhail Kravchuk spoke. The most alarming thing about this recording was that, at the moment when the figure spoke, the readings of the dosimeter installed next to the camera jumped sharply, reaching a level that should have been fatal to any living creature. However, after a few seconds, the readings returned to normal, and the figure disappeared from the camera's field of vision. This recording sparked a new wave of interest in the history of Mikhail Kravchuk and gave rise to many theories, from scientific hypotheses about space-time anomalies to mystical speculations about the return of the souls of the dead. Some associate these phenomena with ancient Slavic beliefs about forest spirits and the boundaries between worlds. Others see in them evidence of the existence of parallel universes, postulated by some versions of quantum physics. In 2015, an international group of scientists received a grant for a systematic study of anomalies in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, including the phenomenon associated with the history of Mikhail Kravchuk. The expedition, equipped with modern equipment, spent several months in the area of the former village of Strakalisai. They installed automatic cameras, motion sensors, thermal scanners, and other devices in places where anomalies had previously been recorded. The research results were published in 2017 and sparked heated debate in the scientific community. Scientists recorded several unexplained phenomena, including fluctuations in the electromagnetic field not related to known sources, sonic anomalies in the ultra-low frequency range, and short-term changes in the gravitational field. Of particular interest was that these anomalies intensified on certain days of the year, especially April 26th, the anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, and January 10th, the date of Mikhail Kravchuk's birth. However, the most striking discovery was the results of the analysis of soil and vegetation in the area of the stone with symbols. Microorganisms were discovered in this area that did not correspond to any known species on Earth. These bacteria had a unique DNA structure that allowed them not only to survive in conditions of high radiation, but also to use it as a source of energy. Moreover, these microorganisms exhibited signs of collective behavior, forming complex patterns resembling the same symbols that were carved on the stone. Professor of biology Elena Kovalchuk, who led this part of the research, wrote in her report, "We have encountered a form of life that does not fit into our understanding of terrestrial biology. These microorganisms exhibit properties that one would expect from alien life or from organisms that evolved in conditions radically different from those on Earth. Especially intriguing is their ability to collective behavior and the formation of symbolic patterns, which suggests the presence of some form of intelligence, or at least communication, at a level inaccessible to our understanding." Researchers also discovered that time flows differently in the anomaly area. High-precision atomic clocks installed at different points in the zone showed small but measurable discrepancies, and the magnitude of the discrepancy increased as it approached the stone with symbols. In the immediate vicinity of the stone, the clocks were behind by approximately 2 milliseconds per hour, which is small for human perception, but is a significant anomaly from the point of view of physics. Physicist Andrei Sokolov, who analyzed these data, suggested that we are dealing with a localized deformation of spacetime. Imagine that reality is a fabric, and in some places this fabric can stretch or compress. In the Strakalisai area, we are observing just such a stretch, which leads to a slowdown in time. If we extrapolate these data, we can assume that the effect intensifies periodically, and at peak moments, the so-called Einstein-Rosen bridges, or simply wormholes connecting different points in spacetime or even different realities, can arise. This hypothesis could explain the strange phenomena associated with Mikhail Kravchuk. Perhaps in 1835, such a bridge formed in this place, through which something penetrated into our world. This something could be a being from another reality or from the future, which somehow materialized in the body of the newborn Mikhail, and his strange language could be the language of that other reality, or perhaps the universal proto-language of the universe itself, about which he wrote in his works. In his last interviews before his death in 2020, Professor Sokolov put forward an even more radical theory. In his opinion, Mikhail Kravchuk and the being or entity recorded by the camera in 2011 could be the same thing. He suggested that this being did not die or disappear in 1887, but somehow moved through time, possibly awaiting the Chernobyl disaster, which was to open the breach. What if Mikhail Kravchuk was a kind of scout, sent by some intelligence from another reality to study our world and prepare the ground for a larger-scale contact? And what if the Chernobyl disaster created the conditions for such a contact? Perhaps we are on the verge of interacting with another form of intelligence, the nature of which we cannot even imagine, Sokolov said in his last interview. These hypotheses, of course, remain speculative and are not recognized by official science. However, the story of Mikhail Kravchuk continues to attract the attention of paranormal researchers and numerous enthusiasts. Every year, illegal groups of so-called stalkers penetrate into the exclusion zone, many of whom hope to see the ghost of a boy speaking a language that should not exist or find new traces of his presence. Local residents from settlements located on the border of the exclusion zone say that sometimes at night, especially in April, strange sounds resembling human speech, but not in any known language, can be heard from the depths of the contaminated forests, and some claim to have seen a tall figure moving between the trees in the direction of the former village of Strzelecki. The full truth about Mikhail Kravchuk may never be known. Too much time has passed, too many documents have been lost, too many witnesses have passed away, but his story remains one of the most mysterious in the annals of paranormal research, reminding us that the world around us may be much stranger and more mysterious than we are used to thinking. And who knows, maybe right now, as you listen to this story, somewhere in the contaminated forests of Chernobyl, among the abandoned houses and overgrown streets of the former village of Strzelecki, wanders the ghost of a boy who spoke a language that should not exist. And maybe he is still waiting for the moment when the stars align differently and the breach between worlds opens again. What would you do if you heard his voice, whispering from the darkness in a language older than humanity? Would you listen to his words or run without looking back? Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved for our own good, but human curiosity is stronger than fear, and it is this that leads us to new discoveries and new mysteries, such as the story of Mikhail Kravchuk, the boy from Strzelecki, who spoke a language that should not exist.